David Martinez, a 38-year-old software engineer and devoted father to 12-year-old Emma, thought his biggest worry was debugging code before deadlines. Then Harold Clark knocked on his door at 7:15 a.m. on a Tuesday morning demanding immediate payment of a $500 noise violation fine for his dog's excessive barking. What happened next will make you question everything you know about your own neighborhood. Before you hear this story, ask yourself, do you really know who's making the rules in your HOA? This happened just 6 months ago in Sunset Ridge, a quiet suburban development in Phoenix, Arizona. The family involved, they're still living there, but everything has changed. This story will make you look twice at every neighbor who holds a little too much power over your daily life. David had moved to Sunset Ridge 3 years earlier, seeking the perfect blend of suburban safety and community standards for Emma after his divorce. The HOA fees seemed reasonable at $180 monthly, and the neighborhood looked pristine with its desert landscaping requirements and uniform mailbox standards. He'd read the covenants carefully before purchasing his modest 3-bedroom ranch home on Cactus Bloom Drive, paying special attention to the pet policy since Emma had been begging for a dog for 2 years. The HOA bylaws were clear: dogs under 50 pounds were permitted with proper registration, vaccinations, and adherence to noise ordinances. No excessive barking between 10 p.m. and 7 a.m., and owners were responsible for immediately addressing any noise complaints. David felt confident when he and Emma adopted Charlie, a gentle 3-year-old golden retriever mix from the local shelter. Charlie weighed exactly 47 pounds, had completed basic obedience training, and possessed the calm temperament perfect for a single father juggling work and parenthood. For 18 months, life in Sunset Ridge felt like the suburban dream David had worked so hard to provide. Emma walked Charlie every morning before school, her face glowing with the responsibility and joy of pet ownership. David would watch from the kitchen window as his daughter giggled at Charlie, his gentle attempts to catch butterflies in their small backyard. The dog had quickly become Emma's constant companion, sleeping at the foot of her bed and providing comfort during the difficult adjustment to their new life after the divorce. Charlie rarely barked. David had specifically chosen him for his quiet nature, knowing that good neighbor relations were essential in an HOA community. Occasionally, Charlie would give a single alert bark when the mailman arrived, or if a delivery truck lingered too long. But these were brief, appropriate responses that any reasonable person would expect from a family dog. David had even invested in additional training sessions, teaching Charlie to respond to a quiet, subtle command that would immediately stop any vocalization. Harold Clark lived 4 houses down on the same street, a 62-year-old retired postal supervisor who had served as HOA treasurer for the past 6 years. Harold's house stood as a monument to HOA compliance: perfectly edged lawn, regulation desert plants arranged with geometric precision, and not a single item visible that wasn't explicitly approved in the architectural guidelines. Harold took obvious pride in his authority, often seen walking the neighborhood with a clipboard, documenting potential violations with the dedication of a military inspector. What David didn't know was that Harold owned Sergeant Pepper, a 15-year-old scarlet macaw with a vocabulary that would make a sailor blush and vocal habits that turned every sunrise into a neighborhood sound assault. Harold's house sat on a corner lot with strategic landscaping that muffled sound toward the street, but allowed noise to carry freely toward the interior homes. Harold had carefully positioned Sergeant Pepper's outdoor perch on his back patio, where the bird spent most of his waking hours squawking, screaming, and practicing an impressive repertoire of profanity-laced phrases. The trouble began on a Monday morning in March, when David received his first HOA violation notice. The official letter, printed on Sunset Ridge whole letterhead, and signed by Harold Clark as treasurer, stated that Charlie had been observed engaging in excessive barking on Saturday morning at approximately 6:30 a.m., disturbing the peace of the neighborhood. The fine was $150, payable within 10 days, with a warning that subsequent violations would result in escalating penalties up to pet removal requirements. David stared at the letter in confusion. Saturday morning, Emma had been at her mother's house for the weekend, and Charlie had spent the entire morning sleeping on the couch after a late Friday night walk. David clearly remembered because he had worked late Friday debugging a critical software patch and had slept until nearly 9 a.m. Saturday, with Charlie never leaving his side. The accusation made no sense, but David approached the situation with his typical methodical mindset. He walked to Harold's house that evening, Emma holding Charlie on his best leash, hoping to resolve the matter through direct communication. Harold answered the door with the tight smile of someone accustomed to being challenged on his authority. David explained calmly that there must be some mistake, that Charlie had been inside and quiet Saturday morning. Harold's response was immediate and dismissive. He insisted that noise complaints were filed by multiple neighbors, that Charlie's barking was a recurring problem, and that David needed to accept responsibility for his pet's behavior rather than making excuses. As they spoke on Harold's front porch, Sergeant Pepper erupted from the backyard with a piercing shriek followed by a stream of expletives that made Emma cover her ears and step behind David. The bird's voice carried clearly through the evening air, a raucous assault that seemed to penetrate every corner of the neighborhood. Harold waved dismissively at the sound, muttering something about birds being natural and different from domestic pets that owners should control. David returned home troubled not just by Harold's inflexibility, but by the obvious double standard. Over the next several days, he began paying closer attention to the neighborhood's actual sound patterns. Every morning between 5:45 and 7 a.m., Sergeant Pepper's screaming sessions would begin, lasting anywhere from 20 minutes to over an hour. The bird's voice was impossibly loud, echoing off houses and carrying at least 3 blocks in every direction. 2 weeks later, David received a second violation notice. This time, the fine was $300, and the letter stated that Charlie's continued excessive barking on weekday mornings was creating ongoing disturbance complaints from multiple neighbors. The letter included a stern warning that a third violation would trigger a mandatory pet removal hearing before the HOA board. David felt his stomach drop as he read the threat. Emma's entire world revolved around Charlie, and the thought of explaining that they might lose him was unbearable. That evening, David made a decision that would change everything. If Harold was going to weaponize official HOA authority against his family based on false accusations, David would respond with the same methodical approach he used in software development, documentation, evidence, and systematic analysis. He purchased a digital audio recorder and began what would become a 3-week investigation into the actual noise patterns of his neighborhood. The results were immediately revealing. Charlie barked exactly 4 times during the first week of recording, twice at delivery trucks, once when a cat wandered through the yard, and once during a thunderstorm. Each instance lasted less than 30 seconds and occurred during reasonable daytime hours. Sergeant Pepper, however, provided audio entertainment that would make a death metal concert seem peaceful. The bird's daily performances began before sunrise and included extended sessions of screaming, squawking, cursing, and mimicking various mechanical sounds with startling accuracy. David's engineering background served him well as he documented timestamps, decibel levels using a smartphone app, and correlation between the bird's noise and any potential responses from Charlie. The data showed clearly that Charlie occasionally responded with brief barking when Sergeant Pepper's screaming reached particularly intense levels, but these responses were reactive rather than initiatory, and significantly quieter than the bird's ongoing noise assault. 3 weeks into his documentation project, David received the third violation notice that he had been dreading. The fine was now $500, and the letter scheduled a mandatory hearing for the following Tuesday evening, where the HOA board would determine whether Charlie posed an ongoing nuisance requiring removal from the neighborhood. The letter stated that David could present evidence in his defense, but that multiple neighbor complaints and documented violations created a strong case for pet removal under HOA Covenant Section 7.3. David's hands shook as he read the letter. Emma was at school, and he had exactly 6 days to prepare for a hearing that could destroy his daughter's happiness. The methodical engineer in him knew that he had solid evidence, but the worried father understood that HOA boards often prioritized maintaining authority over pursuing truth. Harold Clark wasn't just a neighbor making complaints. He was the treasurer who helped set board policy and had significant influence over other board members. That weekend, David made a quiet rounds to neighbors, explaining his situation and asking about their experiences with noise complaints. What he discovered painted a disturbing picture of Harold's selective enforcement patterns. Mrs. Garcia, an 74-year-old retired teacher who lived directly across from Harold, admitted that Sergeant Pepper's morning screaming sessions had been driving her crazy for years. She had never filed a complaint because Harold had implied that birds were protected under different regulations than domestic pets. Mrs. Garcia revealed something else crucial. She had kept a detailed journal of neighborhood noise patterns for the past 2 years as part of her own frustration with the bird situation. Her records showed that Harold's complaints about Charlie's barking consistently coincided with days when Sergeant Pepper had been particularly loud, suggesting that Harold was using Charlie as a scapegoat to deflect attention from his own pet's noise violations. David asked Mrs. Garcia if she would consider attending the hearing to share her observations. The elderly woman's hands trembled slightly as she explained that Harold had significant influence over HOA decisions that affected her daily life, from landscape approval to parking regulations. She couldn't risk making him an enemy, but she quietly handed David a manila folder containing copies of her noise journal entries, suggesting that he might find the information useful for his own research. The Tuesday evening hearing took place in the community center conference room, with 5 board members seated at a folding table facing David and Emma, who had insisted on attending to advocate for Charlie. Harold Clark sat at the treasurer's position, a stack of violation notices and official documents arranged neatly in front of him. Margaret Thompson, the HOA president, called the meeting to order with obvious reluctance, explaining that pet removal hearings were always difficult but necessary to maintain community standards. Harold presented his case with the confidence of someone accustomed to board meetings going his way. He detailed the 3 violation notices, referenced multiple anonymous neighbor complaints, and emphasized the importance of enforcing noise ordinances equally for all residents. He painted David as an irresponsible pet owner who made excuses rather than addressing legitimate neighborhood concerns. Harold's presentation was smooth, official, and designed to make pet removal seem like the only reasonable solution. When David's turn came to present his defense, he opened his laptop and began playing his audio recordings. The room filled with the unmistakable sound of Sergeant Pepper's morning screaming sessions, so loud and piercing that 2 board members visibly winced. David played sample after sample, explaining the timestamps and showing how Charlie's occasional responses were brief, reactive, and significantly quieter than the bird noise that triggered them. Harold's face reddened, as the audio evidence clearly demonstrated that the primary noise disturbance in their section of the neighborhood came from his own pet. He interrupted David's presentation twice, arguing that birds were naturally vocal, and that the recordings were taken out of context. Margaret Thompson asked Harold to allow David to finish his presentation, but the damage to Harold's credibility was becoming obvious. David then presented Mrs. Garcia's noise journal entries, carefully explaining that he had received them from a neighbor who wished to remain anonymous but had documented 2 years of noise patterns. The journal showed consistent early morning noise complaints about bird screaming, with notes about how the sound carried throughout the neighborhood and disrupted residents' sleep. The entries correlated perfectly with David's audio recordings and painted a clear picture of ongoing noise violations that had been ignored because of Harold's position. Emma, who had remained quietly seated next to her father, asked for permission to speak. With the innocent clarity that only children possess, she explained to the board that Charlie was her best friend and had never been mean or loud. She told them about how Charlie helped her feel safe at night after her parents' divorce, and how he waited patiently by the door every day for her to come home from school. Emma's sincere testimony about Charlie's gentle nature and the family's responsible pet ownership created an emotional counterpoint to Harold's bureaucratic accusations. The board deliberated for 20 minutes, while David, Emma, and Harold waited in uncomfortable silence. When they returned, Margaret Thompson's announcement was carefully worded but decisive. After reviewing the audio evidence and documentation presented, the board found insufficient evidence to support pet removal action against Charlie. However, they would be conducting a comprehensive review of neighborhood noise ordinances to ensure equal enforcement for all residents and all types of pets. Harold's reaction was immediate and telling. He demanded to know why anonymous neighbor complaints weren't being taken seriously, why his years of treasurer service were being undermined by manipulated recordings, and why the board was allowing troublemaking residents to weaponize selective evidence against longtime community volunteers. His outburst revealed the entitled mentality that had driven his campaign against David's family, and it confirmed for everyone present that this had been personal rather than procedural. 2 weeks after the hearing, Harold Clark submitted his resignation as HOA treasurer. Citing health concerns and a desire to step back from community service, Sergeant Pepper's morning screaming sessions became noticeably shorter, suggesting that Harold had finally invested in soundproofing or behavioral modification for his bird. The $950 in fines that David had been assessed were formally rescinded by the board, with a written apology for the administrative error in noise violation enforcement. Mrs. Garcia approached David at the mailbox a month later, thanking him quietly for standing up to Harold's bullying behavior. She admitted that several elderly residents had been afraid to challenge Harold's authority, even when his decisions seemed arbitrary or unfair. David's successful defense of his family had shown the neighborhood that HOA authority figures were accountable to evidence and fair process, not just positional power. Emma's relationship with Charlie deepened through the stress of potentially losing him. She began taking more responsibility for his care, starting a neighborhood pet sitting service that helped other families and demonstrated responsible pet ownership throughout the community. The experience taught her that sometimes adults make mistakes, that standing up for what's right requires courage, and that families protect each other when facing unfair challenges. David's methodical approach to defending his family had ripple effects throughout Sunset Ridge. Other residents began questioning HOA decisions more carefully, asking for documentation and evidence when receiving violation notices. The board instituted new policies requiring corroborating evidence for noise complaints and established an appeals process for residents who felt they were being targeted unfairly. The most significant change was cultural rather than procedural. Harold's resignation and the exposure of his hypocritical enforcement had broken the atmosphere of fear that some residents felt about challenging HOA authority. Neighbors began communicating more directly with each other about concerns, often resolving issues through conversation rather than formal complaints. The community became more collaborative and less punitive, focusing on genuine quality of life improvements rather than rigid rule enforcement. 6 months later, David received a thank you card from a young family 3 streets over who had successfully challenged a frivolous landscaping violation using documentation methods similar to his audio recording approach. The family explained that David's hearing had inspired them to research HOA bylaws carefully and present evidence-based responses to questionable enforcement actions. They had avoided hundreds of dollars in fines and established their rights as homeowners to reasonable treatment. Charlie's reputation in the neighborhood transformed from alleged noise nuisance to beloved community mascot. His gentle nature and excellent behavior made him a favorite among children and elderly residents alike. Emma often brought Charlie to neighborhood events, where he served as a living example of responsible pet ownership and the importance of judging pets and their owners fairly rather than through prejudice or personal conflicts. The audio recording equipment that David had purchased for his defense became a tool for helping other neighbors document legitimate noise complaints about construction, landscaping, and genuinely disruptive activities. His systematic approach to evidence gathering became a template for residents dealing with HOA conflicts, showing that authority figures must be held accountable to the same standards they enforce on others. David's professional success improved during this period as well. The confidence and analytical skills he had demonstrated in defending his family earned him recognition at work, leading to a promotion and increased responsibilities. His supervisor noted that David's ability to remain calm under pressure, gather comprehensive evidence, and present logical arguments had made him invaluable for handling difficult client situations and technical challenges. Emma's academic performance strengthened through the experience of advocating for her family and pet. Her teachers noticed increased confidence in class discussions and group projects, attributing the change to her growing understanding that she could influence outcomes through preparation and respectful persistence. The experience of potentially losing Charlie, and then successfully defending him had taught her resilience and the power of evidence-based argument. Mrs. Garcia emerged as an unexpected community leader, using her detailed record keeping skills to help other residents document their own HOA-related concerns. Her decades of careful observation and documentation became valuable resources for neighbors dealing with various violations and disputes. She organized informal coffee meetings where residents could share experiences and strategies for dealing with HOA challenges. Margaret Thompson's leadership as HOA president evolved significantly through the controversy. She had initially supported Harold's authority as treasurer, but the evidence presented during David's hearing forced her to confront the reality that board members could abuse their positions for personal reasons. She implemented new oversight procedures and pushed for transparency measures that would prevent similar situations in the future. The broader neighborhood benefited from what residents began calling the Charlie precedent, the understanding that HOA enforcement must be based on evidence rather than assumptions, and that residents have the right to defend themselves with documentation and logical argument. Property values in Sunset Ridge actually increased during this period, as prospective buyers were attracted to a community that balanced reasonable standards with fair processes. Harold Clark's departure from neighborhood leadership created space for more collaborative approaches to community management. New board members were elected based on their commitment to transparency and fair enforcement, rather than their willingness to maintain strict authority. The neighborhood evolved from a place where residents feared arbitrary punishment to a community where people worked together to address genuine concerns. David's story became a template for other HOA communities dealing with similar authority abuse. His systematic documentation methods and evidence-based defense strategy were shared through online homeowner forums, helping families across the country challenge unfair enforcement and protect their rights to peaceful enjoyment of their homes. The story demonstrated that individual residents could successfully stand up to entrenched HOA authority when they approached conflicts with preparation, evidence, and persistence. The relationship between David and Emma deepened through their shared experience of defending Charlie and their family's rights. Emma learned that her father would fight for what mattered to their family, while David discovered that including Emma in age-appropriate advocacy had strengthened her confidence and problem-solving abilities. Their partnership during the HOA conflict became a foundation for navigating other life challenges together. Charlie's legacy in Sunset Ridge extended beyond his individual story to represent the principle that residents and their pets deserve fair treatment based on actual behavior rather than prejudice or personal conflicts. His gentle presence in the neighborhood continued to demonstrate responsible pet ownership, while his near removal served as a cautionary tale about the importance of holding authority figures accountable to evidence and equal enforcement. 1 year later, David received a phone call from a resident in a neighboring HOA community who was facing similar false accusations about his family's pet. Word of David's successful defense had spread through local homeowner networks, and families dealing with HOA conflicts were seeking advice and encouragement. David found himself unofficially mentoring other residents through the process of documenting evidence, understanding their rights, and presenting effective defenses against arbitrary enforcement. The transformation of Sunset Ridge from a neighborhood ruled by fear of authority to a community based on fair processes and mutual respect became a model for other HOA developments. Real estate agents began highlighting the neighborhood's balanced approach to community standards, and the waiting list for homes in the development grew significantly. Residents took pride in living in a place where conflicts were resolved through evidence and communication rather than intimidation and punishment. Emma's pet sitting business evolved into a neighborhood resource that helped families with pet care, while demonstrating the positive role that well-trained animals could play in community life. Her success with the business taught her entrepreneurship skills and showed other young people that they could contribute meaningfully to their neighborhoods through responsible service and advocacy. David's experience defending his family had lasting impacts on his approach to challenges both at work and in his personal life. He had learned that preparation, evidence, and persistent advocacy could overcome entrenched authority and unfair treatment. These lessons served him well in subsequent career advancement and in teaching. Emma how to navigate conflicts with integrity and effectiveness. The story of Charlie, David, Emma, and their successful challenge to Harold Clark's abuse of HOA authority became a neighborhood legend that new residents learned from longtime neighbors. It served as both inspiration for families facing similar challenges and warning to future board members that residents would hold them accountable for fair and evidence-based enforcement of community standards. Sunset Ridge had evolved from a place where residents lived in fear of arbitrary authority to a community where neighbors worked together to maintain reasonable standards while protecting individual families' rights to peaceful enjoyment of their homes. The transformation proved that HOA communities could balance community standards with fairness, transparency, and respect for the families who chose to build their lives in these neighborhoods. David Martinez, a software engineer who had simply wanted a safe community for his daughter, had become an unlikely advocate for HOA reform and fair enforcement. His methodical approach to defending his family had created lasting positive change not just for Charlie and Emma, but for every resident who valued evidence-based decision-making and equal treatment under community rules. The golden retriever mix, who had faced removal from his home, had instead become a symbol of successful advocacy and the importance of fighting for what matters most to families. Charlie's continued presence in Sunset Ridge represented victory not just for one family, but for the principle that authority must be accountable to truth.